Hi, my name is Aaron Cosenza, and today I'll be discussing open source and open source software. So what is open source? So open source is the denoting of software for which the original source code is made freely available and may be redistributed and modified. Software developers may want to publish their software with an open source license so that anybody can develop the same software or understand its internal functioning. With open source software, generally anyone is allowed to create modifications of it, port it to new operating systems and processor architectures, share it with others, and market it. Many have pointed out several policy-based reasons for adoption of open source. For instance, the heightened value proposition from open source. The main categories that open source focuses on are security, affordability, transparency, perpetuity, flexibility, and localization. So open source has open source software. Open source software is the community software with its source code made available with a license in which the copyright holder provides the rights to study, change, and distribute the software for anyone for any purpose. So the open source model, or a collaborative development from multiple independent sources, generates an increasingly more diverse scope of design perspective than any other company, is that any one company is capable and developing and sustaining long term. A 2008 report from the Standish Group states that adoption of open source software models has resulted to a savings of about $60 billion per consumer. So in the 1980s, software with source code was shared on BBS networks, which was referred to as the de facto open source system. This wasn't really an open source system, but it was the leeway to developing open source systems in the 1990s. In 1991, it was the launch of the Linux, which is one of the most popular open source systems today. In 1997, Eric Raymond published The Cathedral and the Bazaar, a reflective analysis of the hacker community and free software principles. The paper received attention in 1998 and was one factor in motivating Netscape Communications Corporation to release their popular Netscape Communicator as a free software. This source code subsequently became the basis behind SeaMonkey, Thunderbird, Composer, and even Mozilla Firefox. So the source code is an unseen component of open source software. The code is mainly unseen and is used by programmers to develop and modify changes and function to open source programs. This is the most important component of any open source software because it basically has tells it what it does and is able to modify and change any perspective. So basically, there's open source and closed source. So what I've been talking about in open source, you can basically modify and change any part of it at any point in time. However, in a closed source, only the makers can modify the code and content, which is a big difference between open source and closed source. And which is why open source is very popular, because you're able to change and modify anything that you want, and it's able to develop over time. So Linux is one of the most popular open source programs. It is a Unix-like and mostly POSIX compliant computer operating system assembled under the model of free and open source software development and distribution. This was developed in 1991, and Linux was the first real open source software and most popular of its kind. Today, it is mainly used with PCs and Android smartphones. The greatest advantages are the security and free use of software. So Mozilla Firefox is an open source web browser, which is very popular. Even I use it pretty much it's very popular amongst PCs. It has many functions, and it basically functions just as an open source would. and it's able to modify and change over time. It is a very popular web browser, just like with Google Chrome and Internet Explorer and Safari. Open source software is usually easier to obtain than proprietary software, often resulting in increased usage. Additionally, the availability of open source implementation of a standard can increase adoption of the standard. It has also helped to build developer loyalty as developers feel empowered and have a sense of ownership. Open source development offers a potential for a more flexible technology and quicker innovation. It is said to be more reliable since it typically has thousands of independent programmers testing and fixing bugs of the software. The modification of freedom, control, flexibility, and cost effectiveness are the core advantages to open source software. The main disadvantage of open source software is not being straightforward to use. Open source operating systems like Linux cannot be learned in a day. They require effort and possibly training from your side before you are able to master them. You may need to hire a trained person to make things easier, but this will incur additional costs. So open source software is widely used both as an independent application and as components in non-open source applications. Many independent software and value-added resellers and hardware vendors use open source frameworks, modules, and libraries inside their proprietary for-profit products and services. Those are the main applications that fund open source software since they are free user network. And they also funded through commercial beneficiaries for higher use and pay-per-view use to be able to ensure security of their system. So that was open source software. It's pretty self-explanatory. It's basically just the software that is able to use over time and is free to use and modify. We use it all the time, and it is very popular for our tech needs today. If you have any questions,